evening, everyone. Welcome to our first event for the spring semester. My name is Mark Anthony Arsenio. I am the lecture series team leader for Ohio State APOP and the chair for special events and programming with Slow Food Columbus. We're really excited to see folks still entering the room, and so we'll be getting started in a few minutes or in a minute or two. Before we do, just some housekeeping. Obviously, we're going to be recording this session for tonight and having this available the next day or so, hopefully, for folks who weren't able to join us to attend and listen in. If you're unfamiliar with the Zoom platform, one of the things that I want to make sure that you are aware of is that we have enabled closed captioning. So I believe if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see that CC closed captioned. I will apologize in advance. The technology for that is it's this AI system, and so it doesn't get all of the words down correctly, but for the most part, we've been testing it out and it seems to be working for us. If there are any questions that you have, please feel free to put that in the chat. Otherwise, as we go through each of these sessions, please write those questions down and we'll definitely have time at the end for some Q&A. All right, to get us started, we want to make sure that we talk about who these groups are that are hosting this. And so I want to make sure that Lee and Trevor, who are going to be representing Ohio State APOP and Slow Food Columbus respectively, can let you all know a little bit of these groups. So Lee, you should be able to meet. There you go.
Cool. Thank you so much, Mark Anthony. Really appreciate it. So for those of you who don't know me already, my name is Lee Oldershaw. I'm the APOP program coordinator. And just to give you a little bit of information about APOP, we're an all-volunteer organization that provides free access to anthropology-themed educational experiences. All of our members are OSU undergrads, graduate students, graduates of OSU's anthropology department, or faculty members. And we run programs in Columbus City Schools, public libraries, COSI, Ohio History Connection, and programs on campus. In addition to programs like this one. I also, before we go, I have to give a huge shout out to our podcast, A Story of Us, which is currently in its 5th season. The latest episode, if you're interested, is about a graduate student in our department, Taylor Tomhu, who will be discussing her research, which focuses on Black women at the front lines of COVID. She'll also be discussing a new children's book that she's been publishing that aims at helping parents talk about COVID with their children. No opening remarks would be complete without a heartfelt thank you to everybody who's involved. I can't thank Slow Foods enough for partnering with us. This has been just an amazing experience from start to finish. This started a few years ago and it's just been absolutely wonderful. Can't thank Mark Anthony enough for doing all of this work. I mean, this is an incredible series that he's put together and I love every minute of it. So huge thank you to him. And then also thank you so much to our incredible presenters, Ty and Masami Smith, Brian Snyder, and Andy DeHuss, for their insights that they're sharing with us tonight. And if you guys have any questions about APOP, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'll drop a link to us in the discussion page if people are interested in checking out some of our other activities or our podcast. Thanks so much to everyone for being here.
Awesome, thanks Lee for introducing Ohio State APOP tonight. Next up will be Trevor Horn, who's our current Slow Food Columbus chapter leader.
Good evening, everyone. So happy to see so many participants in tonight's event. I want to start off by just thanking Mark Anthony and Leah from APOP to collaborate in the continued efforts of bringing this opportunity to reach out to the community and influence the educational piece of what we stand for as Slow Foods with good, clean, fair food for everyone. We've got some exciting things coming this year. As we transition into a new leadership role for me and Mark Anthony staying around the board and a few other individuals who are working on continuing to expand our opportunities to connect within the Columbus area. Our main focus, we've got a few, but really entirely our goal is to just continue to build connections with consumers and producers. And through that, we feel education as a nonprofit is the best approach. So events like this evening are always on the forefront for us, and we hope to do more and more educational opportunities for people here as we move forward within the year and as hope we get back to some sort of normality. So thank you all again. Thank you for the speakers. I look forward to this series. as always, so much plethora of knowledge and information, and it's great to get everybody involved here and to just continue this connection piece circled around food.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Trevor, for the introduction to Slow Food Columbus. And so really without any further ado, we're going to get started with tonight's panelists and the discussions that we've got before us. And so we've got Brian Snyder, and what I'm going to be doing is I'll be introducing each person as they come up and unmute and get ready to present. But Brian Snyder will be our first presenter. He's the Executive Director of the Initiative for Food and Agricultural Transformation here at The Ohio State University. So Brian, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to participate in this program this evening. I've been thinking about this issue of adaptation and resilience with respect to food systems my entire career, and you can read a little bit about me here on this slide. But I think the principal things to note is that before I came to Ohio State, I had been executive director of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, which is one of the country's largest sustainable ag organizations. And before that, for nearly 20 years, I had been involved with Gould Farm, which is a residential mental health treatment community located on a 700-acre farm in Western Massachusetts. For half of that time, I was executive director of that program. That is the nation's oldest residential treatment facility for the seriously mentally ill. And it's a key point to say that it is located on what is a very big farm in New England, 700 acres. That farming and food systems were literally part of the treatment model there and still are today. In fact, that program has been in existence for 108 years. So that farming model is working pretty darn well. So that's looking at the issues of adaptation and resilience from a little different point of view. And what I really hope to do tonight, as the first speaker in the first event of this series, I feel like it's my job to expand your thinking a little bit, give you some examples historically of where adaptation and resilience were demonstrated or were quite important, and try to keep it interesting for those of you who are anthropologists as well. So, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about INFAC first. You want to change the slide there, Mark? This is our mission statement, and I'll let you read it for yourself. You're going to see that this fairly simple statement contains a lot of variables. And so really the word that is not here that I need to emphasize is that a food system is indeed a system. It involves a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. There's a lot that is a lot to learn and a lot that can go right in a food system as well. But you have to get it all lined up. Really it comes down to the fact that a food system is a very complex mechanism. It's not a simple matter of farmers growing food and then suddenly it shows up on our table. There's a lot that happens in between. And really that complexity of the system ends up being part of the resilience, that the more complex in many ways, the more resilient the food system is. And yet there does need to be flexibility, and that speaks to the issue of adaptation. Let's go to the next slide. And on this slide, you're going to see some of our core values. Again, you can read these, but I'll call out a few of the concepts here in particular to focus on. One is that word diversity, which kind of harkens back to my discussion of complexity and that leading to resilience. Diversity in the food system at all levels is an important part of the success of any food system. The more diversity, the more resilient, the more successful that food system is going to be. And in this case, that diversity includes everything from the crops to the farmers themselves, to the markets, to the kinds of food that we have on our table. And so that diversity does involve people, and so I'll point out our emphasis on equity and social justice as well through the food system. But I also want to look at this last one because this is really quite important to us and becoming increasingly important, and that is the idea of balancing indigenous knowledge and scientific discoveries. That at a big university, of course, we're very familiar with the idea of doing scientific work, experiments, inventing new things, innovating all along the way. But what we find in agriculture and food systems is that there's an awful lot behind us that we have to learn from. You know, when Columbus discovered, quote unquote, discovered America, there was already a thriving culture here and in the Western Hemisphere, all up and down North and South America. There were larger cities here than London, Paris, and Rome at the time. And we actually interrupted a lot of that activity because of not only the effects of conquest, but also disease. But there were very vibrant food systems in place in pre-Columbian times in the Western Hemisphere. And there's a lot that we can learn from that. In fact, a lot of the world's greatest cuisines are really based today on foods that originally came from the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So it's our intent to always keep the scientific discovery and indigenous knowledge in balance. In fact, sometimes, you know, we're known as a discovery theme at Ohio State. Sometimes I refer to us as a rediscovery theme because it's just as important that we rediscover the lessons that had been learned for centuries before Europeans came to this part of the world. Let's go to the next slide. And here, this kind of gives me a chance to emphasize that a little bit more. We do take a transdisciplinary approach to our work, and that involves balancing, again, innovation, which tends to be the scientific endeavor at the university, with imagination, and that brings in the arts and sciences. But then, quite importantly, experience is also an important aspect of our work. We find our work to be at the intersection of these three dimensions. But really, there's a fourth dimension here, and that is time, because that experience is both the experience that we find out in the countryside, those farms, for instance, that have been operated for 4 or 5 generations or even more in some cases, but it also goes way back. It goes way back to pre-Columbian times, and I'm going to have an example to show of that in just a little bit. So these are the things that we like to balance, as you see the quote there from the Association of Public Land Grant Universities. You know, this is a challenge for all universities to find ways of balancing both the physical and the social sciences, but also with the arts and humanities, and communicating that effectively to the public. Next slide. So I'm just going to give these examples very quickly of things that have happened in history that demonstrate resilience and adaptation. If we were in a room together, I'd ask people to guess where this is, but I'm just going to have to move ahead and say that this is in Havana, Cuba. And the story of Cuba, I think, is well known to most people. There has been, the United States has maintained an economic embargo on Cuba for over 62 years now. And this greatly affected their ability to feed themselves, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, because unable to depend on trade with the United States, they did trade quite vigorously with the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union fell, they lost that all-important partnership. So what happened is people found ways to feed themselves. This picture is actually a residential neighborhood, and what you're seeing is the combined backyards of several houses that are arranged around what you might consider to be a normal city block. that there were many city blocks like this where people combined their backyards and formed cooperatives in order to grow food. And when I visited there, I talked with people who had been scientists, doctors, teachers, all walks of life, many of whom left their professions in order to grow food because it was so important to be able to feed their families and their neighbors. And this also established an important stream of revenue for their communities, since tourism continues to be an important part of their economy. And a lot of this food does go into the tourism industry as well. Next slide. And if you think about it, you would never, cut off the food supply or the means of production to a society or an island nation like this just to see what would happen. But that's kind of what happened. This is a city park in Havana that has been turned into an 8-acre farm. And it's located here because what you see right behind it are massive apartment developments. There were about 6,000 people a week that would come by the market that they maintained in the front of this farm. And this particular farm employed 55 people to operate it. So think about the resilience that this required for people to be able to feed themselves. And this is part of why, whatever your political thoughts about Cuba are, this is part of why Cuba has been able to resist so long the embargo that the United States continues to maintain, is that they found a way to be resilient and found a way to feed themselves. Next slide. And this is one that I'm sure many of you will recognize, or you'll begin to recognize right away where this is. This is in Peru. This is a facility where basically it is a experimental station like we would have, like Extension would have at Ohio State and other land-grant universities. This is near Cusco, actually closer to Urubamba in Peru. And by the way, what I got in this picture is only 1/4 of the entire complex that was in this location. And if you want to know how big it is, look at the tiny little specks down in the center there, about 3 or 4 levels up on the left. That's a person. And there's another person on the rim over on the opposite side, just to kind of give you an idea of how big this is. And it was only 1/4 of it. This was like an experimental station where they grew a variety of plants. In fact, DNA testing has found evidence of more than 6,000 varieties of vegetables that were grown in this location. And importantly, because of the changes in the landscape and the way the sun would hit it and the elevation, they were able to duplicate almost every kind of climate that they might encounter. They were able to duplicate the conditions anywhere in Peru and use the technology that they brought out of this site in order to grow food. So then let's go to the next slide. And you will see the results of some of that experimentation. This is a very familiar photo. And if you talk about the need for resilience and adaptation, you might think about the top of a mountain like this. This is Machu Picchu. And what you're going to notice right away, because of the slide that I just showed you, is the structural elements around the outside of the city. The same kind of terracing that you saw at that experiment station. And the amazing thing is that the work that has been done, of course, this is a city that the Spanish never found. It was so remote that the conquering armies were not able to destroy it. And what they have found in actually excavating some of these terraces is that they served 3 purposes. One is that they were structural, which you can readily see. They helped to actually hold the hill together for the structures that were above it. Secondly, they provided sort of like reservoirs to hold water in place as well. So they were constructed in kind of a perfect way with the gravel and sand and other materials in order to hold water for the maximum length of time, so it wouldn't just run down the mountain. And then third, they become areas where they could grow food. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see an entire mountainside. This is on the other side of the city. Waiting for that to change there. And the entire mountainside is a series of these same kind of terraces, and those are granaries in the middle, in the distance there. So all of this mountainside was used for growing food in order to support the population at this location. This was probably a royal retreat. And again, it was never discovered, but they had the ability to grow food even here. So when you hear people talk about urban farming as though it's new, you remind them that it's been around quite a while. This was actually a whole city that was built in order that it could feed itself, that it could grow food for itself. And let's go to the next slide. One of the things that I like to talk about, one of the writers that I like to talk about whenever I'm talking about sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or in this case, the themes of adaptation and resilience, is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is not only a scientist, she's an environmental biologist in the SUNY system. She lives in Syracuse, but also she's an enrolled member of the Potawatomi tribe. And she does a tremendous amount of speaking and writing on the topics of balancing indigenous knowledge with scientific discovery, scientific exploration. And her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is one of the best books I've ever read in my whole life. I recommend it to everybody. These are just some quotes that I pulled out for use here this evening. And my understanding is that we're even going to be giving away a copy of this book to somebody. But you can see the theme here is reconnecting people to the earth, reconnecting the earth in a way that it can heal us because we heal the earth first, really. And there has never been a time for us to be more cognizant of the need for this kind of healing. Both between human civilization and the earth, and even between ourselves. And this is really what her writing is all about, reconnection. And this is a very clear demonstration of how indigenous knowledge and scientific discovery can be balanced, as she is a very competent scientist. And I recommend everybody look into her writings. So I'm going to end there. And I think we're right on schedule. So are you going to give away a book now or later? Is that later?
That's a good way to segue. We'll actually we'll have everyone try and stick with us till the very end, and we'll announce the winners after our Q&A session. But thank you, Brian, for setting that stage for us and for giving us this kind of overview to kick off the series. I will turn it over now, though, to Ty Masami-Smith of NACO Cuisine, and you guys can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mark Anthony. Thank you as well, Brian. Really nice to listen to you. Very educational. Really enjoyed the piece too. You know, giving a shout out to the indigenous perspective and all of that. My name's Ty Smith, and this is my wife, Masami Smith. We're the directors at the Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio. From here forth, we will refer to it as NACO just because it's less of a mouthful. And sometimes we'll even reference to it as just the center in itself. You know, tonight we're going to share a little bit of, you know, about our agency, some of the work we've been doing, and more specifically, you know, the piece that pertains to food with NACO Cuisine. And right now, and I don't want to get too far into it because I want to pass the floor to my wife here, but we'll be talking about, you know, what we're doing in terms of, you know, sustainability, diversity, adaptation, and resiliency. But at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my wife and just have her give, you know, a little bit of insight, because sometimes I think before we can really I guess get at the meat and potatoes of the conversation. Sometimes we have to unpack a few things first, and getting to know a little bit more about what NACO is will definitely be helpful to that process. So I'm going to ask my wife here to go ahead and express those pieces.
Good evening. Nith Clowit, that means good evening in our language. My name is Masami Smith. I am Tyrone's wife, and I'm the executive director for the Native American Indian Center of Central Ohio. We've been here for 25 years, and I've worked at NACO since 2002. So the Indian Center was founded in 1975 by Selma Walker, and she was a Dakota woman. She was a Sisseton-Wahpeton Dakota Sioux from Yankton Indian Reservation of South Dakota. And I would say that NACO is the heart of the Native American community here in Central Ohio. And our main mission is to, service youth and families and our elders, and preserve what we can while we can. So really, we thrive on cultural programming and our community, and preserving ceremonies and, the different culture or cultural protocols within our tribes and intertribal relations that we have currently at the Indian Center. I would say that I keep saying Indian Center. I'm so used to saying that, I'm sorry, but NACO, it houses a lot of different purposes from, it used to be all social services and things like that, to dominating, I feel, with a lot of, community thriving on wellness and culture. So in a nutshell, that's our Native American Indian Center. So I'm gonna give it back to my husband.
The back and forth that we have. There's a lot that we've, come to, I guess, learn along the way in terms of, standing in as leadership and taking on the responsibility of, managing and taking care of the only viable urban Indian center in this state. Being out here 25 years, there's a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of experiences that we've had along the way, things that we've just, have come to understand, what it is. And, to give a little backdrop too about Ohio, it's a state without really any infrastructure in place. There's nothing within this state comparable to what you would find in Indian country out west that can be earmarked or looked upon as, that's very Native specific. We don't find that out here. So a lot of our efforts and our mission work is really based upon the needs and concerns that have been voiced and brought forth by our people. And in all of that, maintaining identity, really looking at revitalizing and restoring the best that we can, our culture. And it gets a little bit tricky, but it's very rewarding in itself at times, because as my wife stated, it's very intertribal focused. So it's incorporating multiple worldviews from a variety of tribes from across this country. And in that, what we've done over the years is we really focused on looking at community development and cultural preservation. And those were the two main areas that we looked at for years. And mind you, we've been at the helm at NACO for almost 10 years now. And early on, we did a very comprehensive needs assessment. We had a planning grant. And in that, it allowed us to put the voice of the people, in the driver's seat and give us real direction. And in that, we created a blueprint. And within that blueprint, it was emphasized over and over again that, you know, we needed to focus on culture. We needed to look at healing. And, you know, in regards to historical intergenerational trauma, you know, there's a lot at hand. And mind you, there's a number of us out here too. And, you know, just a real quick, quick fact of information here. In Ohio, Ohio's noted as having actually the 16th largest population of Native people in this country, which is very surprising. But a lot of that derives from an era called the relocation era. And so there's a number of families out here. And what we've come to find, though, is that who we are out here today as Native people, what we represent, what we stand for, the reasoning behind our mission work at NACO is really to be there and be that rock, that foundation for this new emergence of Native Americans. Because when we rewind history and we look back into it further, we go back into the 1840s. And at that point in time, that's when there was the original indigenous peoples of this area were forcibly removed and put into, pushed off into what was then known as Indian Territory, today known as Oklahoma. So it would be easy to, I guess, get off on a tangent and start talking about some of these historical aspects of things, but we want to kind of bring things forward and talk about where we stand today in the current context. And one thing that can be said too, though, leading into where we are right now, is that one thing that we hold our heads high in identifying as Native Americans is the fact that, you know, there is that thread of resiliency. You know, there is that foundation that's been spoken to, prayed for, lived upon, died for, all of that, you know, so that we could be here today. And even the food that we prepare, you know, you'll see in some of our diets, you know, and these were foods that were given out, you know, as government rations. And, you know, our people had to find a way to make, to live, to survive. And one of the staple pieces in that across Indian country is called fry bread. And it's just a means of, you know, what our people come to know, and, you know, how they learn to use these rations that were given out to them. And so to this day, fry bread is actually still in existence, and it symbolizes this strong, resilient piece to who we are. It might not be the healthiest piece of food out there, we'll be honest about that, but it does symbolize, you know, us moving forward in this world and still being here today as well. So I want to speak a little bit to NACO cuisine, and, you know, I guess, like I was saying earlier, and having my wife, you know, kind of share, you know, who NACO is, what we're about. And in all actuality, NACO isn't just an agency. It's not an urban Indian center solely, just that. It's really the people that personify all that it stands for, and, you know, and what we get up and suit up and show up for every day. And so even with NACO cuisine, which, in a simple answer, NACO cuisine is a Native American street food trailer that's new onto the scene in Central Ohio. And it may be new on the scene in just this part of the country. We're not really sure. We don't know of any other efforts as such. But you know, we really looked into, what does this mean? And we could have named this trailer probably a variety of other names, but NACO cuisine is really what we wanted to showcase, because that's what was important. And that's what is important. And again, NACO being, you know, the key wording in that, again, that's the people. But the trailer in essence is a means of sustainability for our work. And it has three main pillars that it's built upon. Community development, the other is cultural preservation, but there's also an economic development side to it. And so in our work, what we found is that we needed a means to sustain our efforts going forward. And we did a lot of comprehensive needs assessment work, and we did a lot of incorporation of the people's voice. And food was prioritized as a means to really, one, showcasing who we are, helping raise awareness. It allowed us to interact as a people together in an environment that you wouldn't find anywhere else, where we're actually all able to work together, and to instill and just really live out cultural values in the here and the now. And one of the main pieces in that is the transfer of knowledge. And that's, you know, those that carry some of the wisdoms that we have today and passing that on to the younger generation, and really grooming them for even some point in time too, to pass the torch and to be the new leadership for NACO. And so NACO cuisine is a multitude of things. Up front, the first thing that you see is, yeah, we do offer a very unique menu. You know, it's made up of a variety of just exceptional foods that you would find from various parts of Indian country. You can find us online. We're on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can look under NACO, hashtag NACO cuisine. NACO.com is our website. But we're doing some really awesome stuff. We're very excited. When Mark Anthony reached out, you know, one of the conversations we were having too is like, how have you guys, you know, going through, you know, this period of the pandemic, what was things like for us? And do you want to add anything?
Is the time almost up?
Well, I don't know. Let's do a time check here. We got a few more minutes. I'm gonna ask my wife to, I don't want to just sit here and do all the talking, so I'm gonna ask my wife to share a little bit as well.
It's okay. I really love it when he talks. Honestly, I'm the executor. I like to do the work. And you know, I would have to say that what makes us unique for this job, and that was fitting for this community, is Tyrone and I are both born and raised on our reservation. We come from the same reservation in Oregon, so we're federally recognized tribal members of the Warm Springs Indian Nation. And I think that with our knowledge and history and experience of being raised by our people, you know, with our people, before we came here, helped us be able to understand the importance and be able to travel all over Indian country for different ceremonies. Or, you know, Tyrone worked for the federal government at one time for different Indian communities throughout this country. And, you know, it helped us be more culturally competent with other tribes in order to understand their foods and their tradition and their cultures within their tribes as well. So I think the thing that makes NACO cuisine unique is that we have staffed our trailer with all Native people as well. And you know, the intertribal piece is very important to us. So we all come from different tribes, but we all know like that common ground of different dishes that are in most Native American homes throughout Indian country. So that's helped us be able to create dishes and also be able to have traditional and culturally relevant feasts and events at the Indian Center for our Native American community. But the dishes and the food that we have in NACO cuisine and are offering for catering and the menu is it's all from the heart of Indian country everywhere. So, you know, it's not just us and what we specialize in the Northwest, but all over the country. So that's really what makes us unique to run the Indian Center, but also to be able to use NACO cuisine as a vehicle to sustain our Native American Indian Center. So I think that's all I have, really.
In the picture, you can see that, you know, there's our trailer in the back, and, you know, like, I mean, you know, kind of even tying into some of the things that you were speaking to as well, Brian, but, you know, it's food and place are, they're key in, who you identify as and where you're from. And I think, what we can say in our humble experience coming out to Ohio from Oregon, we've lived the first half of our lives basically on our reservation amongst our own people, and my wife's, acknowledging, but that and as well, there's this whole other side to what we've come to know as what we refer to as being urban Indians. And it's been really awesome to see just the sense of connection, belonging, and the great work that we've done at the Indian Center. And through food, we thought, what a great way as well. And again, the community they were the driver behind this. They helped shape this. They helped establish the whole thought process to this. And we just built it. And eventually we were able to write a grant and we applied for this. But essentially it's meant to sustain us, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to our current campaign. And even NACO Cuisine is actually a piece to that. It's part of the business plan. It's one prong to our bigger and larger business plan. But the bigger and better NACO campaign is really essentially us moving forward to actually purchase a place of our own, and to move out of the Indian Center that we have on the south side to actually that of land and structures that would be more suitable and could hold more people, and maybe too, even a little conversation we had with Brian just, in short talk, earlier, but, to develop it into something maybe as miraculous as some of his pictures that he's already even shown. So, so there we stand. I think that's about what we can say for now. We don't want to take up too much more time, and we want to pass it on to Andy and allow him enough time too. But again, NACO.com, you could find our information there if you want to reach out, learn more, but again, I just want to say thank you to OSU, APOP, Mark Anthony, your team. So thank you for having us.
Excellent. Thanks so much to both of you for sharing your story, for all the work that you're doing in the community, and for educating all of us of that great work. So last but certainly not least, we'll turn it over to Andy Dias of Columbus Food Adventures. And Andy, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Thank you, Mark. And certainly thank you to APOP and Slow Food for giving me this platform to talk to you today. So as Mark said, my name is Andy Dias, and I, along with my wife, Bethia Wolf, we are the co-founders, co-owners of Columbus Food Adventures. And so today I'm going to kind of address the topic of resilience and adaptation a little bit on a personal level, but also with a bit of a focus on sort of the immigrant restaurant community and how they've done throughout this kind of the COVID era, so to speak. And to do that, I kind of want to give a little bit more background on us and give you guys maybe some sense of where we're coming from and what motivates us. It really all started about 12 years ago with an experience with a taco truck. I had moved back to Columbus from California. Had certainly been spoiled by the food in California, particularly the Mexican food. And my girlfriend at the time and now wife, Bethia, was a British expat and living in Columbus. So I felt like, it was an opportunity for me to show her kind of what Mexican food was about. And we were very edified by the first experience, curious to learn more. And within about 2 months' time, we had found 45 taco trucks operating in Central Ohio. If that suggests a bit of an obsessive streak in us, probably not an unfair observation. Not only were we finding extraordinary food, we were finding just a tremendous range of regional variety being represented and sort of depths to the distinctions of the cuisine that we frankly had no clue about, and an awful lot of interest in learning more about. And ultimately, we started up a website, now defunct, called Taco Trucks Columbus, where we sort of chronicled our experiences, very much from an inspired amateur's perspective. In going through that, we were in parts of town that, were not sort of known for being places you would go for destination food experiences. And yet in the neighborhoods where these taco trucks thrived, we were also finding a lot of other immigrant restaurants, immigrant kitchens that we weren't hearing about through any other means. They really weren't given any play in the media. And we started exploring those. And again, just sort of kind of having this one thing leads to another sort of an experience that ultimately led us to start up a second website called alteatscolumbus.com. It was shortly after that that my wife told me that she wanted to start a food tour business. She'd heard about it, some of these things happening in New York City, was ready for a change in jobs, and really wanted to find, I guess, a new platform for sharing our enthusiasm with these food experiences and with the interactions with the folks that run these places. And so for about the past 10 years, we had relatively uneventfully run a food tour business. And I suppose I should probably back up a bit, because I know that not everybody necessarily knows kind of what a food tour entails. And so as we have done it, a food tour has been a kind of a cross between a traditional tour and kind of oh gosh, words are failing me here. Scratch that. Essentially, what we do is we take people to a list of between 5 and 7 restaurants that we've chosen for various different merits. And at each restaurant, they get to eat some of the food, kind of the things that we think are best or most interesting to try. And we tell them what we can about the dishes they're eating, any sort of background on the culture that informs that, and then a little bit about the restaurant owners themselves. And, particularly as it relates to the smaller kind of immigrant-run restaurants, it is very easy to kind of get to know them, because they're generally running just about every aspect of the business. So that business worked out very nicely until about March of last year, at which point it simply ceased to be viable. It ceased to be something that we were capable of continuing, even after restaurant dining rooms were allowed to open back up. We were kind of unable to bring groups of our tour size, 10 to 14 people, in, because it would take up the entirety of the available space. And so we certainly had to look for a plan B. And we kind of looked at the things that we had, our relationships with our restaurants, a little bit of social media following, and kind of our personal competencies. And we ultimately decided that we were going to try to do a delivery business with a bit of a twist. We called it Trustfall. And the idea is that for $40, we would deliver a meal for 2 people anywhere within 270, with the only twist being that we get to choose what the food is. And you know, that allowed us to address, you know, some of our concerns, because we were very kind of concerned about the ongoing viability of a lot of these, a lot of the smaller immigrant kitchens under these circumstances. And so, you know, we certainly held it as a core tenet that we were going to pay full price for all the food that we served. You know, we thought, well, this is going to allow us to kind of bring some money to some of these restaurants. There were, I should say that it worked out, but there were kind of a couple of presuppositions that we found were astonishingly not true. One of them was that we thought, you know, given the idea that we're basically having people trust us with food from, you know, I don't know, it could be anything from Senegalese to Afghan to Ecuadorian. We thought, you know, maybe we'll get 60, 80 people a month who are up for that. And the reality has far exceeded that. I think since April, we've done, I think, a little over 4,500 of these deliveries. And the other big presupposition that turned out not to be true was that these smaller immigrant restaurants and food trucks were more susceptible to difficulties associated with COVID than the other restaurants. And in fact, it has been emphatically the opposite. You know, there are some, I think, very kind of practical reasons for that. One of them sort of just being that for a lot of these restaurants, the overhead is lower. For the trucks, the overhead is lower. So that's a bit less of a burden. I think for a lot of the restaurants, the takeout was always a larger part of the entirety of their business. And so, you know, not only were their customers doing more what they typically did, but they were, the restaurants themselves were geared up to expedite on a carry-out basis. But, you know, the thing that struck me beyond that was that there just wasn't the same sense of kind of anxiety that seemed to pervade all the other kind of areas of our lives within the walls of these restaurants. The folks that I was interacting with, and you know, 4 or 5 times a week, seemed to be very kind of emotionally, mentally unaffected by the situation in the same way that everybody else had seemed to be. And you know, it kind of hit me one day, almost in the sense like that I was foolish for not recognizing it. But so many of the folks that I've been dealing with in these restaurants have had adversity in their lives that you know, far exceeds anything that your average born and raised in the US American had experienced. And they, and I think that that certainly was kind of led to a resilience born of experience. But even above that, just the degrees of adaptation, I think were extraordinary. I think I'm going over time now, and I apologize for that. But I sure have a long list of things about the various different things I've seen. So I'll leave that for later. But thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andy, for that. I think we're ending just on time and ready for our Q&A session with everyone. So that's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll basically just have this open conversation with our panelists. And again, thank you to Ty, Masami, Brian, and Andy as well for their participation in this particular opening event. What I'm actually going to do is folks will now have the ability to unmute yourself. And so if you've got a question, just please raise your hand. I'll be moderating the chat session if you're comfortable being on video. And again, this will be recorded. You can put your question there or just raise your hand and ask your question. I'd like to start off with a question that Rick had asked. Rick Livingston, and he wanted to know if Ty, Masami, if you could talk about how you source the ingredients for NACO cuisine. You're creating these dishes that are very meaningful to you. Where do you find those ingredients? To whatever extent you can share, if it's proprietary information.
We can't give out recipes. That's we're gonna put that out there right away.
Oh, that fry bread one though, I was waiting for that.
The reality is a lot of the stuff's that available at the local supermarket, so we can find a lot of that, and so the menu in itself for NACO cuisine is Native American street food. And so when we say street food, these are household favorites. We're not doing anything that's so culturally significant or so traditional that we have to go to the far ends of the country to find these ingredients. But one thing that we do want to do eventually, we do want to be able to, and again, this comes back to the Bigger, Better NACO campaign, but we'd like to be able to think that we could grow our own food, but we also want to be able to create relationships and do business with various parts of Indian country, because we know that there are other places out there that, they could just use a leg up, in their efforts. And so we definitely want to do everything that we can to support other efforts in different parts of Indian country.
So I've got questions that I've written down throughout each of our speakers' presentations, but if anyone else has a question, please feel free to again type that in the chat or raise your hand using the raise hand icon. All right, so my first question
I have a question for Ty and Masami. Do you have land? Do you have some space to be able to grow food? And how serious are you about going in that direction?
Well, without trying to take up too much time here, you can go to our website and, I'll give just a real snapshot of our effort here, but we're calling it the Bigger and Better NACO campaign. And we're trying to achieve the mark of 700K. We're currently valued at 400K. This is public knowledge we're putting out there. We're very transparent with our efforts, but our goal is to acquire at minimum 20 acres with structures as well. But we definitely want to think that with that 20 acres, we want to work that land in the best way that we can. And we want to, we actually really want to bring in a lot of subject matter experts from various parts of Indian country and look at what we might do to, again, grow our own foods, just, make it a very green, friendly environment for, the space itself, but actually the people involved. So, yeah, but, that's a little bit down the road. It's coming around, though. We've definitely had a lot of support, and things have definitely been going in the right direction. And so, in short, Brian, I'm hoping that we can be able to make this transition from where we're at currently to this bigger, better NACO land structures as well within the next year or two. And I did want to add one more piece to the part about where we get some of our food. We do support some of the local buffalo, bison ranchers that are in the area too. So that's where we receive that as well.
Let's see. Katie Hart has a question that I think is related to what I was just talking about. And Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but what about vertical growth? Do you have any indoor growing capacities where you don't necessarily need outdoor space?
I was sitting there, I think I was like, I don't want to hog the questions. Honestly, no. And we have a spot on the south side. It's a nice building, basement, main floor, and all the office areas up on top. But we really need all that space. And so, but we've looked into some things like that. We'd be for sure amateurs and would need some help in better understanding how that process goes. But that definitely is something that we've thought to maybe entertain in due time too as well. So thank you for the question.
All right, so this next question is not for Ty Masami, it's for Andy. Cindy Lim is asking, with immigrant owners possibly being more resilient and having faced great adversity, do you think that the pandemic will be less on immigrant restaurants in regard to closures?
I certainly think that's been the case so far. And I can only think of two of them that have closed, and in both cases, well, one case, it was simply a family that was retiring, and the other one being one that was in a fairly expensive space downtown. But I mean, by and large, I've seen growth, and in particular, there's been a tremendous growth in food trucks. Just over the past, I think 6 months, we've seen an Uzbek truck open. We've seen an Egyptian truck open. That's just north of campus for you campus folks at Hudson and Summit, called Koshery King. And I saw a Moroccan one open, and I haven't yet had the chance to try that. But I'm the entrepreneurialism is astonishing, frankly.
To carry on with that, there's a question from Catherine Gallenstein. Hope I'm saying that right. What do you see for the future of Columbus Food Adventures as we continue through and emerge from the pandemic?
Well, until it's safe to take, food tour sized groups into restaurants, the plan is kind of to do the status quo. And we've certainly been running the trust fall, and playing around with that a little bit, doing some brunch and other things. And we've been doing some kind of local food producer gift boxes. When it is safe to take people back into restaurants, we fully intend to start the tours back up. And our strong suspicion is that that's going to be tricky at the beginning. But we will implement the tours as we can, probably start off with 2 or 3 and then continue to add on from there. But we hope to be firing on all cylinders by the end of the year, if all things go to plan.
Awesome. Brian, one question that I have for you is if you can talk a little bit more about the intersection of politics and food and culture and climate and all these different pieces that are part of this larger system. As you started in the beginning, it's all interconnected. So how might one go about trying to tackle these challenges of adaptation and resilience?
Sure, glad to talk about that. There's a lot of overlap. In fact, one of the things that INFACT wants to do is to create a food systems clinic at Ohio State University, where we're able to bring together all the different all the different disciplines that are required to really do food system work. So that would be like the Fisher College of Business, the Moritz College of Law, the John Glenn College of Public Policy, Public Affairs. You really have to attack these things from all those different directions. Sometimes internationally, food is used as a method of political control, similar to how oil and energy is at times. But in this country, of course, the big game is the Farm Bill, and that's where everybody has to get involved if they really want to affect the way food systems are going to look in the future. And so there's an awful lot of people that are working on that. We have another Farm Bill coming up, and work will be beginning on that this year. And so I would recommend that people find an organization. One of the organizations I'm very involved with is the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. But there are other organizations in Ohio. There's the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association, OFA, which does quite a bit of policy work, both in the state and also beyond. And they're just, I mean, public policy has done so much in order to form the food systems that we now have, that it's really difficult to achieve the kind of change and the kind of progress that some of us would like to see without addressing the public policy. So I would recommend everybody pay attention to that, particularly as the Farm Bill is coming around for renewal.
Excellent, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So actually what I'd like to do is just for each of you in turn, if you could just take a minute, and if you have any closing statements you'd like to share with the audience before we have our giveaways to hand out. So let's start, we'll just go in order. So Brian, if you have any closing statements for us.
Well, I think that this is the right discussion to have. We've been concerned about resilient food systems for a long time, but really it's coming to a head. We have a food system where both the farmers who are producing the food and many communities of consumers that are eating the food are having trouble, are not doing well. And if the system is not working at both ends, then there's got to be change in the middle. We really have to redesign the whole thing. So this is the right thing to be thinking about with climate change now coming upon us and already affecting farms in Ohio. This is a critical discussion for us to have, and everybody needs to get involved because of the political aspects.
Excellent. Ty Masami?
Everyone wants me to talk. I just want to thank you guys for inviting us and reaching out to NACO and NACO Cuisine. And we're excited about our new venture, and to be honest, this is helping us employ people in our community, young people, and, it's helping with their finances through education and everything, and being able to live in the city, coming from the reservation. And also it's a teaching moment. Also, we're teaching them how to cook. Every good Indian woman knows how to cook. So to be honest, we're teaching them how to cook. We're teaching them how to work together as a team, and they're learning about different foods, and NACO in itself, when we do different things with our cultural programming, we're teaching them. So, and it all, mostly everything, is revolved around food. So anyway, thank you guys. And, we're happy to be a part of this.
If you'd like to learn more about us, I just, would say visit our website, start there, and you can find the other links to our social media. Again, that's naicco.com, naco.com. And thank you for having us. And I just want to add too, that it was educational for us as well, and good to meet you, Brian and Andy. And again, Mark Anthony, your team, APOP, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And then Andy.
Boy, I wasn't prepared for a closing statement, but I'll leave you with an anecdote. A few months ago, I went up to a Kenyan restaurant, Wycliffe's Kitchen, run by a gentleman named Wycliffe Ndwati. And as we were kind of talking with him about, working out deliveries, he said, I'm not open for lunch anymore because I'm cooking for the homeless shelters during the lunch. And I said, oh, that's great. What are you cooking? And he got the biggest smile on his face. And he said to me, I learned how to cook penne pasta. And so if that tickles you, that was my intent. I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Andy.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we're gonna now turn to the giveaways, and I'm really thankful that everyone stuck it out this long for this entire event this evening. I've been going back and forth with the different registrations and seeing who's here on the screen. And I think the easiest thing to do will just be pick a number. So we're gonna just have each of our panelists pick a number between 1 and 18. I've got folks randomized on my screen, and then we'll just see who wins what they win. The first thing will be a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass that Brian had mentioned in his talk. So Brian, if you can just choose a number between 1 and 18, and I'll count the screen and declare a winner.
I'll choose the number 7 for 7 generations.
Right
All right, so that'll be Rod Chu. You are the winner of that, and I will follow up with where we're gonna send your copy of the book. Ty, go ahead and choose a number between 1 and 18, except for 7 now.
Why don't you choose?
Why don't I choose? Okay.
And this is for one of the March NACO platters. Actually, before we do this, do you still have February platters available, or are those all sold out?
Yeah, we have them.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Tomorrow's the last day that we're going to be taking orders. So if you want to do that, again, you can go on our website. There's a tab on there, NACO Cuisine, and there's a few sub tabs below that too. But you can learn more about it there. It'll give you directions on how to connect with us via email. But yeah, we do have the February platter, which is the Oklahoma Nations platter, featuring meat pies, baby back ribs, Cherokee succotash, Muskogee Creek beans, and Southern strawberry shortcake. Very awesome. So yeah, those are available. The number I'm going to pick is 13.
Okay. All right, so Angela Aguilar, and we'll actually we'll try and contact you tonight, and if you want the February platter, we can do that. Otherwise, we can plan for March. And then we actually have a second platter available. So Masami, if you can choose a number 2.
I will choose 15.
All right, that'll be Ben Murtis from Anthropology Department. So congratulations, Ben. And I'll be in contact with you, and we'll figure out which one you might want for that. And then the final one is our $40 voucher to try a trust fall with Columbus Food Adventures. So Andy, you got the lucky honor.
All right, we'll do number 3.
Okay, so I promise this was not scripted, but Philip Armstrong, he happens to be my boss. He happens to win this one. I did not mean for that to happen by any means, but I'm going to put that out there. So congratulations, Philip, and you can enjoy that when you get back to Columbus. All right, so with that said, I want to just thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's really fun. And I'm going to do one final share screen here. Let's see. All right, we'll do this the old-fashioned way. First thing I want to make sure to do is you'll see on the screen the participant feedback form. If you can just take your phone and you can focus it on the QR code, you'll get an immediate link to our participant feedback form. Otherwise, we'll send an email tomorrow just reminding you about that. They'll just help us to continue to figure out who's listening in, who's following our PR efforts, and what we can do to make this a better program overall. And then March 9th will be our next event with Jenny Brittenbauer, Minister Aaron and Antoinette Hopkins, and Dr. Barbara Pitt. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening.